when you're like driving down the highway and there's all those divots, right? That if you kind of get off, it goes, and it reminds you to like, okay, those aren't there because like we want to restrict your freedom, right? So you can't drive. They're there so you don't go off the road and have an accident and get hurt or die or whatever. So it's like kind of the purpose of the law. The law is our guardrail, right? Like it shows us the healthy parameters for life.
Hey guys, welcome back to another podcast episode of The Naked Gospel, where we talk about issues around sexuality, everything from pornography to prostitution to marriage, everything in between. Today, joined by Chad Thornhill. Chad has a PhD in biblical studies, and he's a professor of biblical studies at Liberty University. He's got 3 kids, 2 girls and 1 boy, and he worked on an article in the book called Venus and Virtue, which is what we'll be talking about today. A conversation like this is valuable for 2 reasons. One, the church isn't doing so well. The vision of Proven Ministries is to see a revival of sexual integrity within the bride of Christ, and the bride isn't doing so hot. She's ill-clad and she's throwing herself around. And so a conversation like this is helpful because we need to know the resources that Jesus has given us in this gospel. The stuff he came, died, and resurrected to give us. It's important. And we need to know if it works, right? What we have. At a second level, it's not just a Christian thing, it's also a humanity thing. Everyone struggles with anxiety and depression and divorce and promiscuity. Like, we all hurt in a basic way, and we're all trying to figure out how to live out our humanity in good ways. The gospel means good news, and it's not just Christians who are trying to figure out good news and ways to live. The world is asking that question too. And so if you're lonely, then here's an easy way to hook up. Or if you're dissatisfied, then you can get a divorce and it doesn't matter. There are no repercussions. If you want pleasure, here's an app, right? They're all forms of good news, forms of gospel, and we see the devastation of it. And so this conversation lays on top of that by outlining some of the gospel resources for us. And I'm excited to jump into it. Chad, how are you?
Doing well. Good to see you.
You just started your semester, and how's that going?
It's going well. I'm having a lot of fun. Hopefully my students are too.
Yeah. How many classes are you teaching right now?
Teaching 3. Teaching New Testament, theology, and second semester Greek.
Sweet. Very sweet.
Yeah.
Are those staple classes for you?
Greek is. Everything else kind of just year to year shuffles around.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Enjoy being a teacher?
I do.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Think you'll stick around for a while?
Planning on it.
Sweet. Very sweet. So this book, Venus and Virtue, the chapter you wrote on, how did that come to be?
So I was asked to join the project and kind of got brought in later for various reasons. And for me, one of the things I love about writing is learning. Yeah. So I'm often drawn to topics that I have questions about. Yeah. And so I think part of this chapter is, that was exciting to me, is most of when we think about a Christian sexual ethic, it's the don'ts, right? Yeah. We get a list of don'ts in our head. Yeah. But some of the why. Yeah. And then the positive, it's a very negative sort of framework, and the positive piece of that, I just hadn't thought about or explored that much before. Yeah. So I don't think much that I say in the chapter is novel. If you kind of follow the footnotes, there's some nice heavy hitters that had done some work. So mostly I think I see my writing work as more of like a translator of trying to dig into the wealth of resources that we have in Christian theology. And there's so much there, like over the millennia of Christianity, so many great minds that we have we have the frameworks and the concepts there. It's just
Yeah.
a matter of finding them and seeing how they fit together. So that's one of the things that's fun for me is, and then hopefully helping others who aren't specialists or maybe don't know how to pursue some of that benefit from what others have done for us. So
I've found that striking in my own Christian life. I'm Protestant. We're both Protestants. So for like a lot of us, like our kind of Christian history started 500 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think over the last few years, one of my greatest kind of explorations with Jesus is realizing that I have like brothers and sisters who span back 2,000 years.
Yeah.
And they've struggled with the same stuff I struggle with, and they're way smarter than me.
Yep.
And they know Jesus way better than me, and just like just discovering them and reading their works and just sitting with them and letting them be with me in those moments. It's been like a really cool thing.
Yeah.
So it sounds like that's an aspect of enjoyment for you.
My early Protestant experience, if we want to use those words,
Sure.
was far more restrictive than that because I came from a sort of an anti-tradition fundamentalist background. So for me, anything, it's kind of the no creed but the Bible.
Yes.
So I was ignorant of almost of almost all of it, and it's been really helpful. And you can elevate. I think sometimes in an unhealthy way some of those figures, but they definitely give us lots of tools and resources to help with our own journey. So,
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. I've appreciated them. Yeah, it was cool to read through it and see you pull, because that's exactly kind of the issue that you were trying to pronounce for us in the very beginning, where you're like, there is a narrative in Christianity of the body and of sexuality that isn't altogether helpful. It's not monolithic. It's not like everyone was saying this for the last 2,000 years, but like some big figures were that ended up giving us the kind of do's and don'ts narrative that we have, which is so it's just a fragmented sort of narrative to have. Can you lay that out for us real quick?
Yeah. So briefly summarize 2,000 years of history of thought.
You can do it.
So Augustine gets blamed for a lot of things, and I try to be careful not to blame him because, again, he's a rich resource, and it's not just Augustine, but kind of the context the early church was in. Platonism was a Greek philosophical school that certain branches of it kind of tended towards what's referred to as dualism, which is like anything that's made of stuff is bad and anything that's not made of stuff is good. So like spirit is good, and you can see how naturally one might then read Paul, for example, and spirit versus flesh, flesh bad, spirit good.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, I think the kind of the story that we ended up with, the Enlightenment, I think helped reinforce this. Sometimes there's this concept of so the Enlightenment is way after Augustine, like 1,300 years after Augustine, but it's called the noumenal phenomenal split. It's kind of the same idea, like spiritual stuff. There's this distance between the spiritual and the physical, and not the same problem, but kind of reinforced in some ways, I think, how we ended up in, a lot of kind of modern Western forms of Christianity with these same impressions that, stuff is bad, almost like an escapism understanding of, so we suffer so that we can get away from the body, and get to heaven. And it's kind of cut out, what kind of ended up happening is in a lot of ways cut out the center of what the biblical hope for the future looks like, which is a new heavens and a new earth, right? There's the New Jerusalem comes down. There's a city on the new earth.
Like a physical city.
Yeah. We have resurrected, glorified bodies. They're better than the bodies we
physical
have now,
bodies.
but they're physical bodies.
Yeah.
Jesus is the first of glorified humanity. So there's kind of these dimensions that get cut out, And N.T. Wright, who I think I probably interact with, likes to say it's not about us going to heaven, it's about heaven coming to us. Like that's what the future looks like. It's God's presence returns to earth and, again, glorified bodies. So a book that I came across, a couple years after this chapter was written, but it's called The Magnificent Story. It's by James Bryan Smith, and he's written a lot of good stuff. But he has a chapter where he talks about what he sees as like an overemphasis on the fall and human sin nature. So he says, before we talk about original sin, we need to talk about original goodness. Like we were created as embodied, humans, and God looked at all of that and said it was good. Yeah. Like, didn't say it was perfect, right? Because things go awry eventually, but it was good. And so, he's trying to help in different ways people reclaim, like, there is good to be found here in the midst of all the disorder and the chaos that comes with sin. It's interesting to kind of see how Christianity ebbs and flows on different ideas as it goes through the centuries, and we can't help but be influenced by our culture. And the constant like question that every generation sort of needs to re-ask is, seeing, first of all, you have to recognize that you have a context, to see how that context is shaping you, and then driving ourselves back to Scripture and to God and who He is, to really unlearn. I think a lot of growing as a Christian is unlearning things that you've learned either through your own experiences or that your culture's telling you or whatever. So I think this is part of the story that we've, in some circles, have embraced, that we need to unlearn to kind of see, the original good, that there is a positive vision, and the negative then is not just a list of do's and don'ts, but there's a framework that this all makes sense in, that it's supposed to fit together. So that was a lot of what kind of drove, what I saw as like maybe the foundation of the chapter to then integrate and help to see how the dots connect.
That's really helpful. Yeah, there's something at play where you've got the spiritual being good, the physical being bad, but then post-enlightenment where kind of physicalism is deified. So it's like in the church, if you kind of buy into that narrative of spiritual good, physical bad, then it's like, well, what do I do with my body? Because my body, I'm an embodied soul,
right?
So then all of a sudden there are all these resources then that secularism provides, right? Where it's like, like we have awesome ways for you to live physically, right? And so it's just like this easy trap, segue into something just really awful and destructive. So it's interesting to see that play out, and it's helpful. I liked the quote from Wright. It's helpful about us not going to heaven, but heaven coming to us, because we see that in Jesus. Like Jesus, it's like you can't get to me, I'll come to you. Right. Like I'm that desperate to save you, right? And then He comes physically, which dignifies the body unlike anything else. Where God's like, I want you so bad that I will put on flesh, right? And then it's not just like I had to put on flesh to save you, right? He further dignifies by being resurrected in flesh. So like a lot of that plays out just to dignify who we are physically.
And there's I think it's Oliver Crisp, who's so many theologians have such wonderful names, but Crisp and Hooser.
Yeah, I know.
Balthazar.
It's like Boltmann.
But Crisp has this great quote in one of his books on Christology that Jesus he willfully became incarnate to fix our problems, but He eternally stays that way. And that's another piece that we don't really think of. Like Jesus ascended and received a glorified body. And Paul says when we see Him, we'll be like Him. So it's not even just in the moment of Jesus' life and resurrection, and then it's like kind of He goes And like eternally, he's sharing in our humanity.
Yeah.
But gives us a better humanity for us to share in.
Amen.
It's remarkable.
Amen. Yeah. I wrote an article a little while ago talking about like the eternal embodiment of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I got like a lot of pushback from Christians on it. It was like surprising.
Yeah.
You know, I was like, this isn't even an academic piece, but like I'll cite it for sure. Like that's easy to do. But like that idea alone, it's like as though I'm dragging Jesus through the mud.
Yeah.
You know, just to say that he's always with us in body.
Yeah.
You know, for eternity, like that's who he is, and that's how he'll be. And that's how we'll interact with him. So it's. Yeah, like even that right there, you see kind of in a microcosm the bigger issue, which helps us segue. So three big resources that you lay out that the gospel offers us, and the first one is the relationship within God Himself. Want to start there?
Yeah,
please.
Yeah. So God, I try to be real careful when I talk about the Trinity. Because you can become a heretic
so easy,
accidentally, very, very easily. Yeah. So God exists in three persons, right? This is the traditional Orthodox Christian view of the Trinity, and these three persons are distinct. So there's, the creeds. The creeds are wonderful for folks that aren't familiar with them. The Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Chalcedonian Creed, the Athanasian Creed, or the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, the Chalcedonian Creed, the Athanasian, because they give us they give us a grammar to talk about God that's like safe.
Yes.
Like here's how to not screw up talking about God. So the Father's not the Son is not the Father, the Spirit is not the Father or the Son. They're distinct from one another, but they share fully in the divine essence. So, the nature of God, when we think about God's attributes, Jesus is no less God than the Father. The Spirit is no less God than the Father and the Son. So what distinguishes them, that kind of begs the question, well, if they're the same in their nature, what distinguishes them is their relationality, right? So somehow the Son. And the tricky thing about theology, right, is we always kind of have to put this asterisk, like this is analogical language, right? Like where God's making sense of himself to us through human words and ideas, but God is bigger than human words and ideas. So there's a mystery and a grappling and a grasping that like is always an asterisk behind what we say.
Totally.
But there's this relationality. So the Son relates to the Father as Son, and the creeds say that the Spirit proceeds from the Father or the Father and the Son, depending on which tradition you follow. So God eternally is self-related, right? Like there's this inherent communal, relational dimension to God by God's nature. And there's all sorts of ways that I think that helps us understand ourselves and understand the world in different ways. But one of the things that comes from it is like ideas about mutuality that the New Testament plays off of, like we're to not just look out for our own needs, but for each other. And that there is a deep sense, I think, in why we like are drawn to be relational, because we're made in God's image and God by nature is relational. So like human life works best when we're in it together with other people. And so that, I think that kind of focusing on some of those dimensions of the Trinity then opens, again, it gives a framework. It helps us to see why some of these other things are important in terms of how we relate to one another, and not just in marriage, but in the church and in friendships and in all the rest. So there's there's a pattern to follow, so to speak, of who God is, and us being his image bearers, for us to be human-like. We're supposed to be, to be a flourishing human. Means in some ways that we have to kind of follow the pattern of who God is.
Yeah, it is extraordinary. Like I've often seen, because of the difficulty with the Trinity, people kind of like shy away from it, you know, and like try and plant us in different places. But like that, for the truly nerdy, Imago Dei and perichoresis. Imago Dei, just that we made in the image of God. And you have that there, like in Genesis, where it's like he made them man, singular, male and female, right? So you got this plurality within a singularity. And then you've got, I guess with perichoresis, just the idea that God is... I read this work, and the guy was saying God is not a community, but God is like a community, you know? And there's that beauty there, right? That, like, not just of exactly what you're saying, of not just loving yourself, but loving those around you, and not just sacrificing for yourself, but sacrificing for those around you. And this idea that we're made to be communal. We're like culture is a part of almost being godlike, you know, where there's this expression of beauty and goodness and truth that comes out in the way that we just interact with one another. I remember taking it directly to the topic at hand. I remember Lewis talking about specifically masturbation. He was saying he was saying that masturbation is wrong, not for a lot of the reasons that people say it is, but because it's inherently selfish, right? You're taking something that's supposed to be mutual, something that's supposed to be communal, and you're knowing it just by yourself in the isolation of a dark room in a corner, you know? And so that was his rationale for saying, like, it jives against everything that is godlike and godlike in us, you know, in that sense.
Yeah. So to go back and explain the term, right? So perichoresis is a Greek word, for those that might not know. And I think there's a footnote, or there should be if there isn't, but in church history it was originally applied to help kind of talk about the incarnation and Jesus' two natures, but in more modern theology, it might go back to like Anselm or someone, I don't exactly remember, but it's typically used more often of the Trinity. And the idea of the word is it's translated a couple different ways, but like sort of like mutual inhabiting, or the idea is almost like interpenetration. So we think about the Father, the Son, and the Spirit as distinct, but it's not like God is made of these three parts. I like for undergrad students to use the Voltron analogy, right? So it's like you got the 5 lions, and when they come together, you've got Voltron. Right, so you've got like the 3 persons of the Trinity, and when they come together, you've got God. So that's not how it works. They're distinct. They share in the same nature, and so you can't like draw lines necessarily between like where the Father starts and stops the Son. And this concept of perichoresis is to try to help us like wrap our heads around it as if we could, but you know, to help us kind of make sense of that. So again, taking that concept, and human relationships and whatever don't work or look exactly the same way. We're not God like God's Trinity, but we are meant to have our lives tangled up with other people. And there's something, I think, fundamentally about being, again, like a flourishing human that means your lives tangled up with others, and not just in a superficial way, but in like a messy, we're all broken, we're in this together kind of way, where you know, the church specifically becomes a community of people entangled together who are then looking out for the best interest of the other person as the other people look out. You know, our selfish inclination is like, gotta look out for myself, right? If I don't take care of myself, who is? And it's like, well, that's what the church is supposed to be for, like our lives being entangled together, so that as we are trying to help others are also helping us. And you know, then there's sort of like a healthy mutuality that emerges. And it's, I mean, it's that, you know, all of these things are like really easy to say from like a theoretical level, But I think especially in Western culture, where we tend to be more isolated and more individualistic, we, I think, more naturally have kind of superficial relationships. So it's, there's a part of it that we have to recognize that in order to kind of fight back against it, and to allow, not everybody, this isn't like everyone on Sunday morning, get up and share all your horrible secrets about yourself.
Totally.
But where there are key people in our lives that we know have our best interest in heart, and we have theirs, and can spur one another. I think Peter says, right, spur one another on to life and godliness. So again, like, that's without the struggle. I mean, there's not a struggle in the Trinity, right? The Father's not helping the Son be like,
right,
God's perfect.
Yeah.
But that concept of kind of being, intertangled with others, I think, is really applicable. And one of the books I mentioned in the chapter is Joseph Hellermann's When the Church Was a Family, which it's an awesome book, and it's not real technical or anything. It's like written for just like a popular level. But again, that's something that's easy in our context to miss, and like, this was actually what God intended the church to be, for us to live alongside each other, to help each other, to share life together. But not in just a superficial way where it's something on our calendar that we show up and do, but where we actually have deepening relationships that help us. Ultimately, the goal in all of that is to help us grow closer to God and into conformity with His nature.
The image of His Son.
Yeah.
Amen, dude. Yeah, there's to use the word again, there is something dignifying about knowing that I'm designed to be relational. That I'm an introvert.
Totally. Same
I'm
here.
like an introvert. I often use that as a license to isolate, to not be known. And so like there's a discipleship process with Jesus where it's like, Jesus, like as an introvert, like I still long to be known. Like what does it look like to be known as an introvert? Asking him that question, it's beautiful that he wants that. He wants that, and he's as relational with us as he is with himself. Like he's tethered us to himself to be his bride for all of eternity, which is wild to think of. So there are the three. There is kind of the nature of God with himself. There's covenant and there's church. You hit on church as you were speaking. Do you want to traverse over to that, or do you want to do covenant?
We can go to covenant, because they're all, it's all connected. But so covenant, I think, to me, has been helpful in a lot of different ways with kind of understanding some bigger ideas in Scripture. But it's not a term like we use that often. We don't really structure relationships this way that much anymore. So it's one you really have to kind of like dig into the history and the context to make sense of. But kind of like a contract in a sense. And there's different kinds of covenants in the ancient world, but we have these major covenants we talk about in the Old Testament, like the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, and it's God again, like tethering Himself to a people. God's the initiator, so that's the whole the whole idea of grace. There's grace in the Old Testament, blows our mind sometimes. But He tethers Himself, but there's always expectations attached, right? So it's like, thinking of the Mosaic covenant, like, I will be your God, you will be my people, and then it's like, here's what that's going to look like, right? So he ties Himself to a people, but it's not just, hey, I want to fix this sin and salvation issue, and then go live a good life, and I'll see you in heaven, right? Like like the get out of hell free card kind of idea. So covenants come with expectations, and we think about, like law as a bad thing, I think typically, because, it's almost like this pitting of the old covenant against the new covenant. Like the old covenant failed because it was legalistic, and the new covenant succeeds because it's not. But there's, Jesus has a law, right? So Paul talks about the law of Christ. Jesus is a king who has a law, and the law isn't. We're going through a great series at our church right now on the Ten Commandments, and our pastor is doing a wonderful job of framing it this way. But like the law gives you the boundaries of like the good life. Okay, so he's used, which I think is helpful, he's used the analogy of like, I forget what they're called now, but the when you're like driving down the highway and there's all those divots, right? That if you kind of get off, it goes, and it reminds you to like, okay, those aren't there because like we want to restrict your freedom, right? So you can't drive. They're there so you don't go off the road and have an accident and get hurt or die or whatever. So it's like kind of the purpose of the law. The law is our guardrail, right? Like it shows us the healthy parameters for life. And Jesus gives us lots of laws, lots of instructions about healthy parameters for life. So when we talk about marriage as a covenant, that's kind of the backdrop. You're entering into a contract, and these stipulations about monogamy, essentially, which is actually a complicated question in the Bible,
It is.
because you have the whole Old Testament or whatever, but Jesus seems to pretty dynamically affirm like monogamy is the intention. A man and woman committed together for life is the intention. He says God allowed divorce because your hearts were so messed up, not because it's what he desires. So there are guardrails that are, and it seems pretty. Again, it's not as obvious to get there as I think we think it is sometimes. But when you kind of put Jesus in the larger context of being a first century Jew, like that was their sexual ethic. Marriage, sex is for marriage, and it's to be within that covenantal context. And what is supposed to be protective about that, not restrictive but protective, is that is the only setting where there is essentially, you're making a lifetime commitment, you're making a lifetime contract with someone, and therefore, the ideal of like a healthy relationship and healthy mutuality comes into play. And outside of that context, where you don't have those things, absent the covenantal commitment, there's all sorts of ways where you're going off you're going through the guardrails now. And it's, again, not intended to be restrictive, like God wants to take all the fun away, but he understands that that's a protective context. That's a context where that activity can flourish because of the constraints around it, because you have this covenantal commitment to each other. And outside of that context, where that isn't there, sex might be something that's weaponized or that's used to fill a hole or whatever. And there's all sorts of, again, unhealthy reasons to pursue it that's outside of what God intended. So to me that helps. Again, kinds to help to fill in the why, because when I'm an INTJ, so I'm like, I have to solve problems. But to me, without kind of understanding the why, it just seems arbitrary, right? Like God gives all these rules that are very arbitrary, and they're complicated, and sometimes we can't even tell where they come from, because we don't know our Bibles well enough. We just know that these are the rules, and to be a good Christian, you have to follow them, right? And so we build these bad structures around the right things. You know what I mean? So like it's we sometimes get the rules right, but we build bad structures around them where the rules then aren't functioning in the kind of context that's actually healthy. We take the rules and do something unhealthy with them. We don't see them as protective. We see them as like, you know, I'm not going to be a good Christian, or God's not going to love me if I don't follow the rules. You know, I'm going to lose my salvation if I don't follow the rules, or people are going to judge me if I don't follow the rules. And none of those see it in the positive context. Like, the rules are there because here's the parameters for where this is healthy. And now when we go outside of that, there's something destructive actually that's happening to me. Like, the rules are for my benefit and for the benefit of others. And so, like I said, without that larger context, we can get the what right, but when we get the why wrong, I think, misuse. You know, we can actually make a good thing damaging because we've put it in the wrong context.
Agreed. I had heard somebody was reading something. I think it was actually the chapter before yours, and he was saying that in the garden in Genesis, God gave us one no and a million yeses. You know, and I was it was pungent, like that. That was sharp. It hit home for me, and I hear you saying the same thing about, like, they're not. Again, to use God's resources are there for us, not to be against us, right? They don't confine us; they protect us, and I think that's the application of that resource, because a lot of people are getting divorced, and they're asking the question: does fidelity, does faithfulness even exist? Right? And the church to be able to say yes. Our God has made it with us, right? And we are reproducing it, right? That resource from heaven amongst us, you know, which is a very cool thing to be able to say and do.
Yeah, and it is you know, we can, again, like, put things in the wrong context. So, like, you know, God hates divorce, but he gives legitimate reasons for it, right? Like, because people's hearts are messed up. He understands that if there's abuse or adultery, like, he gives people an out because he doesn't want them trapped in a destructive context, right? So, you know, I think there's, you know, I know I have friends who've been divorced and were divorced for legitimate reasons, but that's been weaponized against them by churches, because you know, God hates divorce, and it's almost like we make this illogical syllogism, like, God hates divorce, you got divorced, therefore God hates you. Right.
That's exactly it.
And it's like, you know, your first premise is right. Your second premise is right, but your conclusion doesn't follow. God loves you. And he understands we're all broken. And, you know, we all have parts of our story that we wish were different. And what then becomes an obstacle is when we, you know, for good or for bad or whatever, when we see a mistake or something we wish had happened differently, and then we allow that to define us instead of, like, I'm loved by God. That defines me. That shapes who I am. That shapes the kind of things I want to be doing, not because I have to earn something from God, but because God knows what's best for me. Like, he's actually for me. He actually wants me to thrive. And I can, you know, we almost get in the way either of other people's or our own healing, again, when we take the right no's and put them in the wrong context. And now we've, you know, prevented a person from, or lengthened the amount of time it's going to take for them to overcome some trauma or mistake or whatever that they've made. So yeah, it's we like to simplify complicated things, and in doing so, sometimes the complications are there because life is messy, but also because not everyone's stories or experiences, even about the same things, are going to affect them the same way that it is, somebody else, or come from the same place, or have the same background, or whatever. So like, the church needs to be as for the people, each member as for the others, as God is for us. Like God actually wants us to thrive.
Yeah.
And we should want others to thrive, which means at times we're going to push back when they're doing things that are unhealthy, just like God does to us, right? Like God disciplines the children whom He loves, Hebrews tells us. But it should also be, our motivation shouldn't be just to shame people, or I think sometimes it's, oh, well, I'm a better Christian than this person because they did this and I didn't. It's like we get Jesus points somehow by not making the same mistakes other people did. And it should be, the right thing we should be asking is, how can I help this person? How can I help them get restored?
Yes.
How can I help them see that God is for them, that God wants them to thrive, that God wants to see them in victory, and ultimately in love and in community and all of those things where we live best. But, we get in our own way sometimes.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. Yeah, it really isn't about, like, if you fall,
right,
but who or what you fall into
right.
when you fall. Like I'm constantly caught off guard by how good he is.
Yeah.
Oftentimes I don't ask him questions because I assume the answer.
Yeah.
But when I ask him the question, always caught off guard by how gentle and present he is. Always caught off guard. So yeah, I'm with you on that. And I mean, not growing up, but like living in kind of a Christian college town, I have too many peers who are in their 20s and 30s who have already had failed marriages, and to know that like God adores them, that like God feels with them the estrangement that they're going through. Like he went through estrangement so that he could know what they feel.
Right.
Like that's crazy. Like it's good news. Yeah. Church. Do it up. I think this will be especially helpful because it's easy to take the first two resources and then force them into this box of marriage.
Right.
Whereas church is necessarily bigger than that. There are a lot of people who are single or are divorced who just like, well, what do I do with my desire to be known?
So I'll preface this because I am married, and I think it's a good thing, and I'm hoping to stay that way. I don't know if my wife will listen to this or not, but marriage is a good thing, okay? Marriage is a good thing. But Jesus and Paul both seem to say it's sort of a concession. And again, we flipped. So, I mean, I try to be, especially since I teach, mostly college students, most of them are single. I try to, I kind of have this radar on now in a church context where when people talk about application, and it's frustrating, but like kind of the default is like, okay, here's how you can live this out in your home, right? And it's like, and it assumes not a home of like, singles living together, whatever, but like a home with a husband and wife and children. And that's predominantly, what we have in the church, but it really like reinforces this idea that like if you're single, like there's something wrong with you, right? You either aren't looking hard enough, or like you're so messed up that nobody wants to be with you.
Exactly it.
And
it's like those are
you're
the only two
incomplete.
options.
Like there's no, like getting married will not make you a complete person. And if you think it will, you're going to have a hard realization a few years in when that hasn't happened.
Yeah.
Marriage, again, is a good thing. It's like the only way to be a complete person is to be known and loved by God and to embrace that as being true about you. So, in the church, and I mean, there are churches that, I know there are a lot of churches that are working hard at this or against this, and there's no perfect church because there's no perfect people. So, but ideally in the church, going back to this idea of the church being a family, like it's supposed to provide a context where we're known and loved and where we have people that are for us. And that means, single, celibate, married, divorced, whatever, that the church becomes a context for, Hellermann would say, which is really, again, really interesting, but Hellermann would say where we have kind of created this pecking order of, priority should be God and then our family and then the church. He says we actually get those two backwards. He said when you read the New Testament, the priority is God, the church, and then your family. And ideally, your family envelops into the church. But when your family doesn't envelop into the church should be where you find your identity, not in your biological family. And so when you see Jesus saying, like, I've come to separate, fathers and sons and mothers and daughters, etc., Hellermann says that's what he means by that. Not that he wants to break up families, but that if your priority is your allegiance to Jesus, then naturally it's going to be belonging to his family. And that doesn't mean we abandon or never have anything to do with our biological families. Again, we should hopefully love them into the family of God, but that should be, our priority. And so we've kind of, I think, I'm not a great modern historian, but I think part of the church's reaction, whenever the church reacts to things, it tends to do it poorly. Like, we need to be proactive. But I think part of the reaction to, like, sexual revolution and some of that was really to bear down on traditional family values and structures. Yeah. And which, again, those aren't bad things necessarily, but it has at times done it to the exclusion of anything that doesn't fit within that framework, when there should be, the gospel should be equally good news for the married and the unmarried, for the divorced and the committed, for the gay and the straight, etc. Like, there should be a place where people can come into the family of God and be loved and grow and deepen in their walk with God because they have meaningful relationships within the church. So that's, there's kind of this ideal versus reality, and the physical churches are never going to be perfect, but the more they can embrace that ideal, I think the more they'll see that their congregations actually flourish.
I dig it a lot. There's Wesley Hill. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's celibate, has same-sex attraction, and he's done a lot of work on kind of the covenant church resources to try and weave them together as a resource for those who are single, and not just same-sex attracted celibate, but like single people, just generally speaking, of like, what is it? Because we have isolated covenants to just marriage, and he just like walks you through the Bible, and he's like, that's just not the case. Like, covenant as a resource is so much bigger and deeper than that. And he does a lot of work to try and impart that back to us, which I find remarkably valuable. Just the idea of like, hey, like I live with you. That doesn't mean we have to have isolated lives, nor on the vice versa that like we are married in any particular way, but like actively being in community together. And even like the word community, like, it just hits a little shy of covenant, doesn't it? But like actively practicing covenant, practicing brotherhood, right? Practicing sisterhood, or have like a drug background. I didn't meet Jesus till I was 19, and then this family that I didn't know from Adam, they just took me in and loved me back to life for a year, you know? And I have baller parents. They're awesome. Yeah. But I didn't know how to be their son until this couple that took me in parented me, right? And they brought me to the household of faith that they're in. And like, I, for whatever reason, was then able to start practicing being a son to my actual parents. But the redemptive feature came from this couple and this family. And that renovated me, renovated my soul, you know. So I'm with you, man. It's beautiful.
One of the other things that Hellermann points out that I don't know I had noticed before I read him, but like the labels that we use today for Christians, right? Like a Christian or a believer or something like that. The term that's used most often in the New Testament is the word adelphoi. You know, it's siblings, it's brothers and sisters. So this idea again of a church being a family, and in the ancient world, your blood relatives were where your strongest bonds were. So again, like kind of surprising to us, but like the father to the children and then the children among themselves were viewed to be the strongest bonds, not even necessarily husbands and wives. And so when, you know, Paul and others take that language and that imagery then and say this is church, what they're saying is like the strongest bonds, strongest relational bonds possible are what you should be finding when believers come together. That again, like we're entangled, we're committed to each other's good, and again, it gives like it just gives a deeper model of what we should be aiming for. Then I think sometimes we sell church short. Like we know we're supposed to do it, but we don't know why, and that's a big part of the why. Is to have people that we're walking, you know, side by side with through life, who can come and support us when we need it, and that who we can go and support when they do. Yeah,
and church is used several different ways in the New Testament, whether it's local or geographical or universal. And one of those kind of applied meanings is very much being the household of faith together, practicing family together, and just those who know covenant together. And so there's a sense in which that's so that's easier to do, and it carries a bit more meaning than just going to a place every week. And it's like, okay, these are my brothers and sisters, and it's just theoretical at that point, you know, because there's hundreds of people in the room, and I'm an introvert. You know, and it's like, all right, I got an hour and a half to be known. You know, it's like, God bless, it's not going to happen. You know, but like I have a group of guys, and I'll just create like a video every now and then and just send it to them. Like I was struggling bad like a few months ago, and I just created a video and sent it to them, you know, and like they were there in an instant, and it's more meaningful than like because the idea of covenant is before the fact, whereas confession we always like do like after the fact. It's like, oh, I already fell. But like covenant, it's like, no, stand with me in the grind before, because I hurt real bad. I want to be known. You know, and that is elegant. It's just incredible to see Jesus's body be able to function that way. You know, it's cool. It's very cool. So how I guess the question that drops out of all of this is, Chad, how do you practice this in your family? How do you practice this with your life? I
mentioned earlier the theoretical is easier than the practical.
It always is, man.
I think I don't know. Probably the biggest thing I was talking with a colleague about this the other day, but probably the biggest thing that has been like in front of me lately that is connected to this is like to shape my main goal in life should be to love people well. And you know, when Jesus is asked, what are the two greatest commandments? It's kind of like, what are the two most important things you could do with your life? love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So like everything that's in you, that includes your body, that includes your mind, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. And, part of it takes defining that word love well, right? Because our culture usually uses love just for affection, or like a strong emotion. So like, I love pizza. I love, like I have a strong emotional affinity to pizza. But so love, the biblical sense of love is again attached to this idea of covenant. Like we're committed to people and we're committed to their good and we're committed to their good even when that might cost us something, right? So like there's this whole self-sacrificial piece to love. And where do we get that from? We get that because this is what the Trinity is. God is love, not just loves, right? But God is love. Love is a part of his nature.
Good distinction.
He's relational in the nature of God. There's Father, Son, and Spirit. So there's loving, relational unity. And for that, then, we don't, the theological piece of this is we then can't that's what God is, so we just do that. Like, the love that we're supposed to have for one another can only come from God. Like, we don't have it in ourselves to do that well.
Yeah.
And so it's really this picture of like the abundance of God's love overflows into us, and then as we're filled up, it can overflow to others. So that's kind of my, if my kids can leave our home and say, like, our parents loved us, I don't know that as a parent you can hope for more than that.
Yeah.
For my wife to know that my husband loves me. And so, I won't even say always. I don't usually do that well because I'm an introvert by nature. I teach all day. I'm around people. I want to go home and just find some quiet.
Yes, and amen.
And children aren't quiet. And I love my children. They're beautiful. But, so I can't do that naturally. I have to be known by God, to be loved by God, and then to be able to, from that abundance of his love for me, to love other people well. It's a huge working process that I'm not very good at, but that just means I need to be with God more. And that's the abundance of his love will make that more natural. So that's kind of been a focal point for me lately.
I dig it. I'm right there with you on not being very good at it. I recall a friend of mine is the father of the family that took me in, and he had said to me once, he said we're all in a discipleship under Jesus of love, and that struck me. The simplicity of it struck me. So it's just like, how are you practicing loving God and loving neighbor, even loving self? There's an aspect of it that's been remarkably helpful, and it's what you pointed out there in 1 John. We love God because he first loved us. And if there's an inability on our part to know how to love God, our first reaction really should be, God, I'm having a hard time seeing how you love me in these moments. Will you show me? Help me to see. Give me eyes to see and ears to hear, because I'm struggling to see the way you love me. And that then allows us then to love our neighbor as we love ourselves, because we know we have that, and he's affirmed that in us. That's the kind of discipleship you can give your life to. It's worth living.
And it's been in the last maybe 2 or 3 years, I've been reading a lot of Henry Nouwen and Dallas Willard. So if folks want to kind of get some resources to help on that journey, those two have been really helpful to me. But Nouwen's basically like, your whole job is he has this great quote. He has so many great quotes, but you know, your goal in life is to know that you're loved, and then like once you know that, life is just a way to say thank you. Yeah.
Golly.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah.
It was like all through my head. It's like, put that on a bumper sticker. That's
Yeah.
Facebook worthy. Put that on my tombstone. Like I was like, shoot, that's good. As far as a book from each starting point, would you have a recommendation?
Yeah, I'm gonna mess up the title. But Nouwen has a book. There's something like Beloved in the title. That's a good place to start. I think it's like a daily reader. Willard has so much, but probably a good one to start with him. And the beginning of it is a little theoretical, but it's worth the payout when you get through it. It's a reflection on Psalm 23, and it just came out a year or two ago. I'm missing the title again.
I think those descriptions alone will help point people.
Those would be two.
Google is really
good
clever.
Place. Yeah, Google is clever.
Yeah.
If you search Willard Psalm 23 book, you'll probably find it. So
for sure. Nouwen, Beloved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Nouwen, Beloved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I dig it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with us.
Absolutely.
It's cool just to hang out with you in this setting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any final word?
Yeah.
Cool.
Love God, love others. You know,
Amen.
doesn't get we complicate it sometimes.
Yeah. If we can end
main
there, this is a good podcast.
Yeah.
Guys, thank you for being with us. The proven curriculum, Men, Women, and Wives, focus a lot on the kinds of resources that Chad and I were able to discuss today, this type of stuff that is in Chad's article. There is no kind of secret sauce to getting well. Looking at Jesus will change the way that you see the world and yourself. The curriculum leads you through that's 12 weeks of just every day looking at Jesus, and then coming into community and knowing covenant with those guys within a church setting to see Jesus and to reflect him. And just to know covenant with one another. So I'd recommend the resources. We'll have them down at the bottom. And stay tuned. Be with you guys again soon.